So how are things going last week? Questions, or what are you thinking so far about Microsoft SQL? Making sense? Challenges, concerns, or just like, oh yeah, this is easy compared to AWS, this is not a problem.
It's making a lot more sense now that I got through that issue that I was having with that first setup there.
Yeah, the SA account comes back and bites people, and it's because it's just this weird thing that for some reason, anything else in the Microsoft ecosystem, you have a standard type username, which is administrator. And then you have Microsoft SQL Server, and they just do the acronym SA. And you're just like, SA? That doesn't sound like a username. That's just two letters. And you see it, it doesn't register that that's actually a username. And then the difference between Windows authentication and SQL authentication, which we'll go over a little bit here, and we're going to get into more so next week, because Windows authentication has some weird caveats about how it works and where it starts tripping you up. Because when you're using SQL Server Management Studio, Windows authentication only works by default with the user that is currently logged in. So if you happen to be logged into a server with, like in our case, administrator, and it was a domain administrator account, but for best practice, you don't have domain administrator actually as a user on Microsoft SQL Server that it's allowed to log in. Then if you use Windows authentication, you couldn't connect to that machine by default because it's automatically using the account you're currently logged into the machine as. There's a workaround for that, and we'll walk through that next week. But that's one of those sort of weird nuances. That's why I start you guys with SQL authentication, because it's easy to get working and it helps make life a little easier. And then the firewall, a couple people have gotten tripped up by the firewall, either on the Linux server or on the Windows server, about not opening port 1433. My in-person class today, I just had one person where they opened it on one server, they opened it on Saturn, but they forgot to open it when they went over to Remus and set Remus up. And they were wondering why they couldn't connect to it. And that's usually what trips people up. So you just need to remember port 1433 needs to be, you need to poke a hole through the firewall to be able to get to it from any other server. Any other places people got tripped up or questions relating to the pieces we've covered so far before I start diving in? Okay. So 2 labs this week. First lab, pretty straightforward, doesn't take very long to get through the first lab. The second lab is a little funky, and I'm going to show you some shortcuts on the second lab that I have it written one way, but you're going to really probably want to do it another way, or turn off this one piece of the tool to make your life a little easier. Microsoft added this one feature to Visual Studio Code that if you're a seasoned coder and you're doing it as something that you do all the time, probably is really cool. But if you're somebody like us who is not coding every day and don't live in Visual Studio Code, it can be really, really annoying because it wants to autocomplete, and it's very aggressive about autocompleting. And will start putting things in when you don't want it anytime you try capitalizing a letter, which makes the lab rather hard to do. So I'll show that coming up. So this idea of Microsoft SQL Server authentication. So part of the thing about Microsoft SQL Server is you have 2 different types of authentication. You have Windows authentication and you have SQL authentication. The default when you install Microsoft SQL Server is to just use Windows authentication, unless you're installing it on Linux. And then if you install it on Linux, the default is for SQL Server authentication. So with that, right place to click. So SQL authentication is that the authentication is less secure because the password is stored on the server rather than being stored in Active Directory. And so all those credentials are on the server that actually is doing the work. So every user account that you make using SQL authentication, although it's hashed, it's stored right on the server. So if you somehow get into the server, you can actually crack the accounts and then you can get into the databases. But especially when we're setting up something like in the scenarios that we're doing, it's very handy that you don't have to worry about Active Directory, that we're only worrying about our little ecosystem on the SQL server when we're trying to actually troubleshoot and get things set up for the first time. So it's very handy to have. And also SQL on Linux, as you went through in the second lab last week, getting Linux to play with Active Directory and do Active Directory integration with SQL and Linux, it's not straightforward. And in most cases, you're like, well, why would I need to go through all that if all I'm going to do is use this as a backend for my web front end? And you shouldn't need to. So you don't need to have Active Directory in order to run Microsoft SQL on top of Linux. It's only if you need to do that integration that we need to go through all those steps that we did in the second lab to try doing that integration. So to have SQL Server authentication be as secure as possible, things that you want to do is you want to use strong passwords. That's sort of a given. You don't want to do weak passwords like password 01 that we're using. You would never ever want to use. One of the things that's really scary is until probably about 10 years ago, it was really common practice for vendors when they're installing some application that's using a SQL Server backend to use SA with no password. And at that time, Microsoft SQL Server actually let them install it that way. So the root level account on the SQL Server had no password associated with it. And needless to say, a whole lot of those systems got owned. It was a really, really bad practice. And finally, Microsoft wised up and said, yeah, there's no way you can install this server without having a password defined. And it has to be a complex password now, too. So use SQL Server authentication only when necessary. Use Windows authentication wherever you can. Limit the number of SQL Server logins and database users. Grant them only the minimal amount of permissions needed. Use encryption such as SSL and TLS to secure communications in transit between the SQL Server and something else. So in summary, for SQL Server authentication, can be useful alternative to Windows authentication. Smaller use case when you want to do it, but there's certain scenarios that's going to be your only option. Windows authentication can either leverage Active Directory or it can leverage the Windows credentials on the server that you install it on. So let's say you had a standalone Windows server that didn't have Active Directory. You could actually have Windows accounts on that standalone server and then have Microsoft SQL Server leverage those Windows accounts. So that's a secondary way that you can actually leverage Windows authentication on it. Primarily, it's designed to leverage Active Directory, but it is, both of those do work. It's more secure because the credentials aren't actually transmitted over the network, and the user accounts can be created in an Active Directory environment. You can do group policy, you can do all sorts of things to make it work a whole lot better. So login credentials are operated and managed by Active Directory. So it's doing Kerberos, it's doing full encryption. Everything that you need for that transaction is in a really secure state. Let's see. So with SQL, the thing that starts getting more confusing is, so SQL is an application on top of Windows. And then you have the databases, and that's your SQL instance. And again, we can have a single instance, which is our default instance, which is what we installed in all of our servers. And then you can have up to 65 additional child instances on that server. Each of those instances can then have multiple databases installed on each of those instances. Each database then has its own security, and you have to have database authentication on each database to say who that is allowed to log into the instance is also allowed to do something with the database and using what rights. So do they have rights to modify? Do they have rights to read? Do they have rights to delete? You know, do they have it? And the administrator level rights at the database level, it uses the acronym DBO, so database owner. So DBO is the equivalent of SA at the database level. So the DBO for a database is the database owner, and the DBO can delete, create, modify, or do anything you need to on that at the database level itself for the data contained within the database. So we have this granular security structure that you have Windows authentication or SQL authentication to log into the instance. Can't do anything with the databases at that point, but you can just see that there are databases that live on that server. And then at the database level itself, you then will have secondary rights that any of those users that are allowed to log into the instance, you then grant them additional privileges at the database level of what they can do at the database level. And I'll explain this looking at the actual servers in a little bit. I just wanted to start the conversation sort of at the abstract level, and then I'll do a sort of a show and tell of how it works at the database level. Yeah, I sort of walked through that already. So the risk at the database level is, of course, weak passwords, password reuse, brute force attacks, SQL injection. All those are different things that can be problems. Like anything, you want to use complex passwords. Ideally, for authentication, you're using multi-factor authentication in an Active Directory environment. And also, it's always the least privileged sort of mentality is you only grant privileges to users that they need to do their work. You don't grant them anything extra. So you're trying to minimize how much they actually have for security, so you don't have to worry about somebody being able to do something that they shouldn't do. One of the things that we're going to do a lot in the labs this week is restoring a database to Microsoft Windows. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. The biggest thing to remember is that the database file that we need to restore, which is going to be the .bak file, needs to physically be on the server that we need to want to restore the database to. So if the server is Vulkan, our Linux server, we would need to have that file on Vulkan to be able to run a restore process on it. If we're doing it on Saturn, it needs to be on Saturn. If it's on Remus, it needs to be on Remus. And we'll go through that as part of the process. But where that gets confusing is we're going to be running those operations from Jupyter. So we're going to be connecting in with SQL Management Studio to do a restore, but the actual file needs to live on the server that we're going to do the restore to. And that's one that people tend to get turned around in this lab. And then when we do this in the practical exam, this is one of the steps that sometimes people totally get messed up on because they can't visualize where the file needs to be. And so they have the file on Jupyter and they can't figure out why they can't find it to do the restore. So we'll go through that. Linux and Windows is similar. On Linux, the tricky part is, the other part is that the SQL Server service needs to be able to see the file. So this is the other piece that gets people turned around, because let's say you're on Saturn and you're logged in currently as a domain administrator account. You download the worldwide importers.bak file to your downloads folder. You go over to Jupyter and you connect in to Remus and you want to do a restore of the database, and you go searching for the directory structure and you can't find that back file that you just downloaded. And you're like, well, I just downloaded it on the server. You go over to the server, you go, I can see the file. You go over to Remus and you can't see it. Any idea why? What would cause you not to be able to see that file? So it's part of the Windows directory stuff. So what it is that you're logged in as the domain administrator account called administrator. That account has a user profile. The downloads directory is part of that user profile. Only that user can see things in their user profile. SQL Server is running as SQL exec. SQL exec does not have any privileges to see that file structure. So SQL exec can only see things that it has rights to. So for doing this type of operation, what I recommend is that you create a folder in your C drive called temp. Copy the worldwide importers.back to that temp folder. And then when you go to Jupyter, you're going to be able to navigate to that temp folder. And voila, your worldwide importers.back file is going to be there. But if you leave it in the downloads folder, you aren't going to be able to see it because you don't have rights to it with the SQL exec account, which is what SQL Server is actually using. And it has no rights to that downloads folder for the domain administrator account. Same thing works on Linux. On Linux, what we're going to have is we're going to have that you're logged in as an account on Linux. SQL Server is running as a service. That service does not have rights to the file structure of a user and will not be able to see anything in that user's profile. So what you need to do is put it into the /temp folder at just above root, which all accounts have access to. And then when you connect in through SQL Management Studio from Jupyter to Vulkan, you'll be able to see that .bak file, do your restore, and the world is going to be good. And we'll walk through that as an example, but I just wanted to sort of talk through these couple slides here. Okay, so before I jump farther, and I don't forget, I want to give the attendance code and then I'll go into demo land. So attendance code for the day. Oh, forgot the C on code. BL1PP3RT. Flippert. Then we'll go into some demos. Everybody got it? Anybody need it a little longer? Okay, so let's get that off the screen. Okay, so we're going to go and we're going to start with what is set up on lab 5. So what we're going to do, let me get the right lab up there. Okay, so in lab 5, what we're going to do in lab 5 is we're going to do the same thing 3 different times. First we're going to go into Saturn and we have to install, or we're going to go into SQL Configuration Manager and we're going to look at a couple things. So on lab 5, I'm going to go over to Saturn. And just make that go away. Okay, so first thing it has us doing is going into SQL Configuration Manager. So when you install Microsoft SQL on a Windows server, it will have SQL Configuration Manager. It will not have SQL Management Studio. So SQL Configuration Manager, when you click on Start, will be the one that has the red toolbox. And so what we want to do is we're going to go to SQL Server Configuration Manager. And then we want to go to SQL Server Services. And then we want to make sure our SQL Server service is running. So SQL Server service has this glitch that occasionally when you restart the operating system, that the SQL Server service does not start automatically. Something else starts in its way and it doesn't start and just sort of sits there and goes, I'm just going to wait and waits till somebody does something specific to it. So if you're having problems connecting to a server, one of the things you always want to do is double check to make sure that the SQL Server service is actually running. Ours is, so we're good there. The other thing that you want to do is double check to make sure that you're under your client protocols, that TCP/IP is enabled and that your default port is 1433. So the different things that could cause you to not be able to connect to a SQL server. The SQL Server service isn't running. The TCP/IP service is not enabled and the default port is not 1433. So 3 of the things that can cause SQL Server to not be able to allow you to connect are right there. And then lastly would be your firewall rule, is you just need to make sure that in Server Manager that for your domain, we have our advanced setting and that we've, come on, get back there. We have an inbound rule and that we've created an inbound rule for port 1433 that is allowing inbound traffic to port 1433, any domain joined computer. And it's a TCP rule. So as long as you have your TCP rule for port 1433, you have your configuration manager, SQL Server services running, and that's the one that we're running as SQL exec. And then we have that our protocol TCP/IP is enabled. So once you have all those, then you should be able to connect to it remotely. And so if we go over to Jupyter, and we have SQL Server Management Studio, we can select Connect, Database Engine, and we're going to connect to Saturn, which Saturn's IP is 55. We're doing SQL authentication, so we make sure SQL authentication is selected. Windows authentication usually is the default. User ID is SA, and then our password. And then we should see our connection over there. When you're showing that you're connected properly, what I'm going to want to see it in a screenshot is that this little part here has been moved over enough, because by default, it usually will be about there. What you want to do is move it over enough, because what it actually shows up here is it shows the account you're currently logged in as. And if I see it say -SA, I know you're logged in using SQL authentication using the SA account. If you're logged in using Windows authentication, I'll actually be able to see the Windows account username that you're logged in as there as well. So that's one of the things that you're going to want to be able to show when I ask for a screenshot showing that you're connected to a server with a specific account. That screenshot is going to be the important thing to show. Okay, so that will get us through 1Q1, and it'll get us through 1S1 because we are looking at the SQL configuration manager in both of those. And then we have it that we're doing a successful connection. So that would be 1S2. So that would get us through a whole bunch of things. So in the lab 5, what I have you doing is a non-standard practice. Normally, you do not install SQL Management Studio on the servers that are running Microsoft SQL Server. You always have it that you're connecting in remotely from a remote server. For troubleshooting, especially as you're learning Microsoft SQL Server, it's really handy to have Microsoft SQL Server or SQL Management Studio installed on the same server as the service, because then what you can do is see, is it installed properly and can I connect to it locally? If the answer is yes, okay, SQL Server is installed properly. Then you go, okay, can I connect remotely? No, I can't connect remotely, but it's working okay. If I'm connecting locally, that means, okay, something's getting in the way. So the things that could get in the way would be the port, the service, or the firewall. So that's how you can help sort of troubleshoot where the problem is as you're going down sort of that troubleshooting chain. It just makes it easier when you're learning to try and figure out where your problems are. So in our case here, we connected just fine. So we were able to do that. Then what I have you do is you basically repeat the process with Remus. And so you're connecting from Saturn to Remus, from Remus to Saturn, and then you're connecting from Jupyter to Saturn. And then lastly, you're connecting, you're doing back and forth between those. So you're making sure that you can connect from any one of your servers to any of your other servers. And so as long as everything is set up and all your firewalls are in the right place, that shouldn't be a problem. Once we've gotten past that point, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first database from SQL Management Studio, which is a really pretty straightforward process. So here we have it that we're connected to Saturn. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our databases. We're going to right click on our database and we're going to say new database. And then we're just going to give it a name. I'm just going to call this one my database. In the lab, I have a specific naming convention that you're going to want to follow. And then you just say, okay. And voila, we have a database. So for user accounts, so I was just talking before about the user accounts, and now we'll sort of walk through them. So to connect into the instance, those user accounts, after you've installed it, are under the security folder. So you have your instance up here. So this is your instance name. We have the databases under that instance. And then we have another folder called security. And within security, we have a folder called logins. So these are all of the accounts that by default are now on this system allowed to log in. So here we see our SA account, and here we see our domain administrator account. Again, domain administrator account in production, you'd never have somebody who has that level privileges be able to log into your SQL server. That's just bad practice. For our case, it's the only account we happen to have an Active Directory that we can use, so that's why we're using it. But let's say we wanted to create a SQL Server account that we want to have a login. So we're going to make an account for Peter. So we're going to create a new login. So just right click on logins. We're going to say that that account, oops, is going to be a SQL login. And then we're going to give that login a name. It's going to be Peter. And then we're going to give Peter a password. And we're just going to do password 01. Okay, and then we're going to not turn on the user must change password at next login to make our life a little easier. And then we're going to say OK. And I didn't type my password twice the same. Now it should. Okay, so now we created this user Peter. So at this point, Peter could log in remotely. So if we wanted to disconnect, we could reconnect. And instead of SA, we could actually log in as Peter. And then use the password for Peter. And we'll connect. And so now Peter can log in, and Peter can see that there's databases on the system. But Peter doesn't have any rights to do anything with those databases. So he wouldn't be able to do anything if we wanted. He can't view it. He can't do anything else. He can just see that there's a name of a database, and that's all he can do. So because right now, Peter has no rights to do anything on this system. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect, and we're going to reconnect as SA. So we can actually work with the databases, and we're going to give Peter some rights. Okay, so now we're connected to our database. We have our security, and this is the easiest way to do it. So we're going to go into our account Peter, and we're going to say, okay, what is the server roles? And we can see on the server roles, he only has public access. So he only has the access to log into the server, can't do anything else. That's okay, because this is a user. This isn't somebody who needs to do administrative things, but we want Peter to be able to work with a database. So what we're going to say is under user mappings, then it'll show our various databases. And we have the database I created. So we have that my database. So what we want to do is give Peter the ability to work with my database. And we're going to say that he is the DB owner of the my database. He doesn't have rights to any other database, but we're going to give him rights to that one. And then we're going to say OK. So now if we disconnect as SA, reconnect as Peter. And then we go to our databases. And we can actually click on my database now, and we can actually see information in the database. We can go in and see tables, and then we can actually go to the system tables, right click. There isn't anything in the tables yet, but what we could actually even do is say new table. And it'll come up and say, okay, what do you want to call that table? So we can actually create things, we can delete things, we can do all sorts of stuff associated with the database now that we granted this user rights. So we'll disconnect again from there. As Peter, we're going to connect again as SA. So does that make sense? What we had is we have the first level of security is to log into the server, and that's under the security folder. So that's the who is allowed to connect to the server instance of Microsoft SQL Server. It can be a Windows account. So if we wanted to add a Windows account there, let's say we wanted to add a Windows account, we would do new login, and then we would do a search in Windows. should pull up our Active Directory. Oh, I didn't put a window or a name in, so maybe it's going to take a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to come back in. Try that again. So we're going to go new login. We're going to let me make an account first quick. We'll go back to Mars. Tools, Active Directory users and computers. Go away. And we're going to create a user. Will just be Sally. Password never expires. Yes, we know that. And so we just created a really basic user called Sally. She lives in Active Directory. Now, if we go back to Jupyter and we want to do a search for Sally. Plus. Pretty sure this is the domain. Yeah, I do. Okay, so what am I getting for an error? I'm getting a. Okay, so I'm getting an error that is saying, I don't know if I can do that because I can't tell if I'm joined to the domain. So what we're going to do is, oh, it's saying this. It can't tell if Saturn is joined to the domain. So Saturn is joined to the domain, but it's not sure if Saturn is or not. And that's why it's being cranky. Part of why it's not able to tell if Saturn's joined to the domain or not is because we do have the firewalls on. And so what's happening with our firewalls on in this case is that it can't query if that is some of the Active Directory type ports. We're only allowing it to query on the SQL ports. It's also why when we're on Jupyter, we can't get it. We're getting a little question mark here of what type of server this is over here, because it can't actually query anymore because we only opened up one port for 1433. So that's why it's not allowing us to do that. So if I just went over and turned off our domain firewall, then we're going to be able to see a whole lot more stuff. So I'm just going to temporarily turn off firewall for the domain network. And then we'll go back to Jupyter. Then we'll disconnect. And then reconnect as SA. Okay, now we can actually see the little icon that says, okay, it's in a running state. We can go into security, go to logins. Now, if we go to new login and we want to look for Sally, now it's pulling up that it actually can do a query into Active Directory. And we go check names. Go to advanced, find the users. That's really interesting. Oh, I see why it's. We don't want it to look in Saturn. We want to look in the entire directory because it was looking locally on Saturn. I should have seen that. There, it found Sally on Trantor. And then we can say, okay. So now it added Sally. And then we can grant Sally rights to a database. So we could actually, under user mapping, say that Sally has rights. And let's say we gave Sally backup operator rights on that database we created, my database. The other place you can look or actually change rights is if we actually went to the databases themselves. So I usually have it that I show people how to do it from the user and push it down to the database. It's also possible to do it from the database and then grab them from the security folder. So here, if we go to my database, we actually have a security folder there, and that security folder has a users folder. And then you'll see now that Sally is in our user folder. So what you can actually do at that level is say new user, and then you can look for either the SQL users who currently have a login, or even SQL users who don't have a login yet and create a login for a SQL user. Or we can even do a Windows user as well. So you can do it from the bottom up or the top down. I like showing people from the top down because it's easier, and you can do it for multiple databases. Whereas when you're doing it bottom down, you're only looking at an individual database. So this is going to get you through, let's see, about 2S2 in your lab 5. So that's the first lab this week. So the next thing that you need to do is you need to restore a database. And so to do that, first, what we have to do is we have to go to Saturn. And on Saturn, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to mount our file share again. And so to do that, in Canvas, I have the document out there with, actually, I'll show you so it makes life easier. So when you're in Canvas, I have the little FAQ, TARDIS and class info. And here is the part about how to mount the class share. So you can mount the class share from any of your virtual machines. And so what you do is you just right click on network, map network drive, / 10.10.0.190 / TARDIS, connect using different credentials. Credentials are in the lab document I just showed you, or the FAQ, sorry. Then you connect, and then you'll see our class CNTS 2213. And then what we're looking for this particular part, we're going SQL resources. And we want the worldwide importers full.back. Right click, copy, go to your C drive, make a temp folder if you don't have one already, and paste it to your temp folder. So again, you don't want it in your downloads folder because you aren't going to be able to see it. So we want it in our temp folder. So once it's in our temp folder, then we're able to go over to Jupyter, connect to that server. So we're connected to Jupyter. And then what we're going to do is on databases, we're going to right click, restore database, select device, and then there's these 3 ellipses over to the right. So we'll select those, select add, and then what we're navigating here is the file structure on Saturn. We aren't navigating the file structure on Jupyter, and this is where people get confused. And we're navigating that file structure with the rights of the SQL exec account because we're connected in as a SQL service. So only what that SQL exec can see will we be able to see. So we can see our temp folder just fine, which is where we put that. But if we go to the users folder and we go to that administrator Trantor, we aren't going to be able to see anything because we don't have rights to it. So just a heads up of why we're doing it the way we are. That's why we put it in that temp folder. There's the file we want to do for our restore. Select OK, select OK, select OK one more time. Takes a little bit to restore. So while that's restoring, any questions of what I've done so far? Okay, our database is successfully restored. So now we have it, that we have a new database called Worldwide Importers that we imported. It has lots of tables. And if we right click on a table, we can actually pull back the top 1,000 rows. And actually, we have lots of data. So we're going to have lots of data to play with for other labs coming up in the next couple of weeks with our sample database we just brought across. And that is pretty much, and then you will do that on Remus and Saturn. So you're going to restore a database on both Remus and Saturn. And that's the end of the first lab. So the first lab, relatively straightforward. So the second lab, what we're going to do is on the second lab, we need to do this same thing that we just did, but we're going to do that on a Linux server. So on the Linux server, it's a little harder because we can't mount a Windows file share from a Linux server. So when we go over to Vulkan, we need to find that worldwide importers file somewhere else. So there's a couple ways you can do it. Since we have Firefox on here, we could go to Canvas and grab it from Canvas. Or what you can do is also with Firefox is you can do a search, because this is something that Microsoft, this is a file from Microsoft, so you can actually get it where you just do a Google search for worldwide importers. And then GitHub. And you find worldwide importer sample database for SQL Server. Cool. And then what we're going to do is we want to find latest release. And there's our file. So we'll just click on that to download it. That will download it to our Linux server. So again, this is much, much faster than trying to mount a Windows share, because a Windows share, we would have to launch CIFS and we'd have to do all sorts of other stuff. I do have in the lab document how to do this the hard way. This is the easy way. Again, I will show you a way and I'll tell you a way, and there's multiple ways to do things. So we now downloaded to our server Vulkan. We have the file we need. So now we just need to put it in the right place so we can actually see it remotely. So what we'll do is we will go to the file manager in Linux. We will go to our downloads directory. So now we have a worldwide importers full.back. We're going to right click on that and select copy. Go to other locations. Go into our computer. Go down, find the TMP folder, and then we will paste it in there. This is similar to the temp folder that we created, the temp folder we put on the root of the C drive on our Windows box. Same sort of idea, but Linux already has a temp folder at the root of the directory, so we have it there. We'll go back to Jupyter. We'll connect to Vulkan. And the nice thing is you can actually have multiple database servers connected. So we just need the IP address for Vulkan, which is 50. We're going to connect it as SA. Now we're connected to Vulkan, which we can tell by we have our little penguin there for Linux. And then what we'll do is we'll go to databases, and then we want to right click on our databases, restore database, go to device again, select our ellipsis, select add. And then what we're going to see is we're going to see the Linux directory structure. So here we have /, which is our root, and we want to go down to /tmp. So the one thing that people sometimes get turned around about here is you will have a /tmp within the user folder for the user that you're actually connected to, which is the one that is running the SQL Server service. That's not where we put it. Where we put it was in the /tmp at the root. There's our worldwide importers. We select OK. Select OK again. Select OK. And it will start restoring our database. Successfully restored. And so now over here you can see worldwide importers has now been restored on our Linux server, and it has been restored on our Windows server. So that's one of the first parts that we're going to do in Lab 5.5. So I sort of skipped around where that is in Lab 5.5. That is the more important part of Lab 5.5 because that part is going to be on the practical exam at the end of the semester. So that being able to get the file to your Linux server some way. So I just showed you the easiest way. There's another way that I show you how to do in the lab, or you can go to Canvas and download it from Canvas. So you have 3 different ways to get the file on your Linux server. Then you just need to get it somewhere that your SQL Server Management Studio can connect to it and see it. So it needs to be in the directory structure that you can navigate to, and then you can do the restore on it. So that's the first part we're going to do, and the most important part of Lab 5.5, because that's what's actually going to be on the practical exam at the end of the semester. The rest of Lab 5.5 are things that are nice to know, but aren't as important. Other than, well, actually, there's one piece that is important. So let's do we need to turn on the SQL Server agent on our Linux server. Because see, with our SQL server here for Windows, we can see that the SQL Server agent is currently in a disabled state. On Vulkan, mine actually is currently on an enabled state because I forgot to disable it before class because I enabled it in my class this morning. So I'm going to go through the steps, but mine's already enabled. But how you go through the steps of enabling that is on Vulkan. We go to a command prompt or terminal prompt, sorry. And we're going to go and we have to go to the location in order to do the config. So what we need to do is to do sudo /opt /MS SQL /bin /MS SQL -conf. So we're going to the configuration file for Microsoft SQL. And then we're going to set SQL agent dot enabled, and it's enabled with a D on the end. And we want to set that value to true. So what we're doing is we're changing a config state by doing this. So again, with Linux and also with Microsoft SQL Server, you can change a config state, but it doesn't change the running state. So this will change our config state, and then it's going to ask for a password for SU. Is that the right one, or did I have a different password on this? Nope. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Oops. Let's see what I did. I had a typo. Couldn't type enabled. Okay, I'm having a... Come on. Okay. Let me double check my sudo /opt /MS SQL /bin /MS SQL -conf. That would be it. I missed an N. I said conf. I didn't type conf. So conf set SQL agent in AB LED is set to true. Okay, so then what it'll do is it'll give you a prompt saying SQL Server needs to be restarted to apply this setting. So what it's just basically telling you is you change the config state, but the running state hasn't been changed because in order to change the running state, you need to restart Microsoft SQL Server. So in order to restart Microsoft SQL Server, we need to do a sudo system control. So system CTL, so system control, restart MS SQL -server. So we're restarting the SQL Server service. And that applies then that change that we did to it. And then we can also do, if we want, rather than restarting it, we can look at, see what the status is. So status of MS SQL Server, and it should show as active and running. And you can do a Control-C to get out of that window and get back to a command prompt. And then ideally what you will see is if you were connected from Jupyter, you won't see this change. What you would have to do is do a right click and do a refresh. So SQL Server Services doesn't automatically refresh stuff in this dialog box unless you manually click on it, and it will be at the file level. So if you want to see the new database that you created, you actually have to right click on that and do a refresh, and then it'll refresh what anything that is a child of the folder you're in. But it won't refresh if you're at the parent level, everything down below it. So it's a little weird on the refresh part. So just be aware of that when you're doing stuff, because sometimes people will go, but it didn't do anything. And it actually did. It's just that you didn't refresh it and you can't see it. Okay, so we got our SQL Server agent running on Linux. We got our database worldwide importers restored. We got on Linux, we got it restored on Windows. We walked through how to do some login accounts, how the accounts then can be granted rights on the databases. So we're doing pretty good. So those are some of the key things that you're going to need to use later. Those are the really important things. The rest of what I got here in Lab 5.5 is going to be stuff that is sort of cool, but it's not going to be on the practical exam. So I'll just sort of let you know that. So you need it for points for the lab, but you aren't going to need it for the practical exam. And also I'm going to give you a couple things that you have multiple ways to do it. Okay. Oh, the other thing that I do have in the lab is I do have two ways to do what we just did. So what we just did was this part of enabling the SQL Server agent on Vulkan. We did it from the command line on Vulkan. It is possible, if for some reason you can't get that to work, to do it from Jupyter using what's called a SQL query statement. And so if we were doing it this way on Jupyter, what you would do is you would, on Jupyter, be connected to Vulkan. You would open a new query. Let me just close that. So you have Vulkan highlighted here, select new query. And then what you would do is there is a SQL query statement that I have listed. You may be able to paste it in there, or you may not, like mine did not paste properly. So your mileage may vary. Most likely you're going to have to type it in. So then you would be able to do that statement, which is right here. Once you have that statement entered, you would then be able to do execute. And then what that statement will do is it will actually enable the SQL Server agent. So what it does is it goes, first part of it is set. So it's SP underscore configure. And this is one of the annoying things here is, Windows doesn't like underscores. And so what a lot of times you will see is that it hides the underscore because it says, oh, this is misspelled, and you can't see the underscores. So just be aware that there's an underscore there. So it's SP underscore configure, show advanced options, and 1. So that's the first part. And whenever we do the command go, when we're doing a SQL query, that runs that query. So this first one, basically we're running this command. Next one, we're going into this command and doing a go. And the third step we do is running this command and go, and then that one will actually enable it. And then the last part, we're doing that part. And then the SQL Server agent will start. So that is sort of a secondary way to do it. First way I showed you to do it is the fastest way, more efficient way. And if you're doing it in the practical exam, probably the way you're going to want to do it. But like anything in Windows, there's usually more than one way to do it. And you will potentially have a use case where you need to do it that way instead of the other way. Okay, the next part of the lab, we're going to use a new tool to connect to our SQL servers. So I have you install Visual Studio Code on Jupyter. Visual Studio Code, the installer, can be found on the Windows share on TARDIS. So if you go into our class folder, there is a folder called VS Code. You go in there, there will be a Visual Code setup, and that will install Visual Studio Code. Once Visual Studio Code is installed, the next thing you need to do is install Microsoft SQL extensions. So this little icon over here is your extensions. You want to click on that. And this is one that's a little different than the actual lab document, because the lab document itself was I made last fall, which turned out it was a slightly different version of what my Visual Studio Code is, because Visual Studio Code's been updated. So on the new version of Visual Studio Code, all you have to do is click on extensions. It pulls up the extensions window. And then what we want to do is we want to look for the SQL Server extension. And so if you do a search for SQL, it will pull up the SQL Server extensions. And what we want is the SQL Server extension that does develop Microsoft SQL Server, Azure SQL databases, and SQL data warehouses everywhere. So we want to grab that extension and install it. Once that extension is installed, you will get two additional little pieces down here, one that says database projects and the other one that will say SQL Server. So first you install Visual Studio. Once Visual Studio is installed, the next step is you're going to go to Extension Manager and get the SQL Server extensions. You will then, mine's already installed, but you would click in Install here. It will install that SQL Server extension. Once that SQL Server extension is installed, you get two additional buttons here on the left. And then SQL Server is the one that we're going to want to actually use once we actually have it installed. So once SQL Server is installed as an extension, we're then going to use this to connect to our database servers. So we'll open this connection stream. We'll select the plus to add a connection. And then you're going to see up here that it has all this stuff. What you just need to remember is that this is just going to be like when you're connecting using SQL Server Management Studio, but you're doing it one line at a time. So the first thing you need to do when you're connecting to a SQL server is you need to know, how am I connecting to it? And so we're going to connect with the IP address. So let's say we want to connect, we're going to connect to Vulkan, so 192.168.79.50. Then hit enter. Then it's going to say, okay, what database do we want to connect to? And we're going to connect to the default, so we can just hit enter. What type of authentication are we going to use to connect to it? We're going to use SQL authentication, so we can just click on SQL login. What username are we going to connect to? We're going to use SA. And enter. Password for SA. And then enter. Save the password. Yeah, we're going to save our password in this case. And then we can name our profile. And so for this one, I'm going to do Vulkan 2. Because I already have one Vulkan. And then it's going to test the connection. And then it's going to say, okay, encryption was enabled, so do you want to save a certificate for this? Yes, we do. So we're going to enable Trust Server Certificate. Testing the connection profile. Profile created and connected. So we're actually connected to Vulkan now. And then what we can do is on our connection, we can expand that. And we can actually see almost like what we see using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Is we can see on Vulkan, we can see that there's our worldwide importers database. We can actually expand on it. We can go down to tables and actually see all the tables down there. And we can even right click on one of the tables and say select top 1,000 rows. It's going to come up and say, okay, here's a query to do that. And then if we click on And it actually was going to run the query for us, and then it brought the results back. So that's pretty slick to be able to do that using Visual Studio Code, because Visual Studio Code is what you're going to use. And I'm not going to save that. If you want to, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to close that. If you want to build applications to talk to your database, you're going to be using Visual Studio Code. So if you're trying to troubleshoot and you're trying to work on things, Visual Studio Code is really sort of handy to be able to do that. Okay. So let me just connect using Vulkan. So once you have it set up and saved, you can just connect to it really easily and connect right to your databases. So that's going to get you through 2S1 and get us connected to the databases. It shows a slightly different process. So this is one where the GUI has changed a little bit from when I created the lab document. So just a heads up on that, that the process I just showed you, the steps that are being done in there do the same thing. This is just how the GUI works in the modern one versus how it worked before. But the goal that you're wanting to get to by the time you get to the screenshot for 3S1 is you want to be able to connect to the database and be able to show that you're connected to the database, which is this part right here would be your screenshot for 3S1. So once we've actually connected to the database, now what we want to do is we want to actually be able to do something and create something. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a database using Visual Studio Code. So what we want to do is we got a couple different ways we can do this. So what we're going to do is on Vulkan, we just have our database area selected. We're going to do a Control-N to then start a new file. We'll select a language, and then we want to select SQL. So do SQ, and then it'll bring up the SQL language. So now we have it that we're in the SQL statement. This would be like if we were running SQL command from the command line on a Linux box. Same sort of thing. So what we're wanting to do is we want to create a database. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with our code, and we want to do a start typing SQL. And then it's going to give us a list of things that we can do. And it's like, oh, cool. And what we want to do is we want to create a database. So we'll select the SQL create database. And then it comes up and it pre-populates all this information for us, which is sort of cool, but it's going to get really annoying in a little bit. So I'll show you how to shut it off too. So what we want is the create database, and it's going to say, okay, what is this new database's name going to be? So we need to give a name to the database. So we're going to call this particular database, we're going to create Vulkan DB. But sort of the cool thing about this is we can actually start typing. And it did a replace almost perfectly, and then it did something really weird to us. So this is a feature that isn't sometimes a feature called IntelliSense, and is trying to basically predictively think of what you just were going to do, and then it fills in things automatically. And it was doing really good until I hit the letter D, and then all of a sudden it went, oh no, I'm going to add this other stuff, and that's not what we wanted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get back to that step, because now it had, okay, put Vulkan everywhere we wanted. We're good. We don't want it to do anything more. So the key is be careful when you're doing it. And a workaround at this point is if you actually hit Shift and then do D and then hit Shift again. Oops, sorry. Shift D. Then it wants to do all that craziness. But if instead of hitting Shift, you hit Caps Lock D, Caps Lock again B, then it's not going to do that, but it also didn't add it to your other ones. So this is one of those things that's sort of annoying when IntelliSense is turned on, that it wants to sort of take over anytime you try doing an uppercase character in the SQL Studio. So what we can do is we can turn that off. Oops, sorry. Or you can sort of do a temporary workaround, which is just that whenever you need to capitalize, you use caps lock rather than doing your shift key. Because anytime you hit the shift key, what it's going to do is it's going to go, okay, I'm going to take whatever you just entered and see if I can have what should be there and try filling it in, which is really annoying. Okay, once we've actually entered it all properly, so what we have is that our new database is called Vulkan DB, and then it brought in the code that we wanted to fill in. So the name is Vulkan DB, and we're going to create the database Vulkan DB. Once all that's there, then what we're going to do is we're going to say over here, we're going to execute our query. So the green little start arrow over here. Then it'll say, what database server do you want to run this against? And we're going to select Vulkan. And then it's going to test the connection. Then it's going to run our script against it, executing our query. And it's going, oh, we got a problem. And so ours blew up on line 5. And so what it's doing is it's saying, can I create file? Because it already exists. And it's partly because I've created, deleted this database a couple times. So what I need to do is I need to give it a new name that hasn't existed before. So I'm going to do database 2. And then I'm going to run it again. And complete it successfully, but it doesn't show up over here. So what we need to do is right click, click on refresh. And there's our Vulkan database 2 that we just created. So we just used Visual Studio Code to create a database on our new server. That worked pretty slick. That one isn't the one that's going to give you headaches. This next section is the part that we may want to do a different way, because this IntelliSense is going to get you pulling your hair out. My students in my day class, especially a couple of them, this next section, how IntelliSense makes things ugly, just made it really, really hard to do. So just giving you a heads up that I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it. I'm going to show you the way I have it in the lab, and then I'm going to show you a much easier way to do it. Okay, so I'm not going to save that. We'll close that screen. Close it open. Okay, so the next part, we want to create a table in this new database that we just created. So we created this new database called Vulkan DB, in my case, Vulkan DB 2. And what we want to do is in that, we want to actually create a table. So right now it just has the drop ledger tables, but it doesn't have any other tables. So what we want to do is we want to create a database in that particular one. So what we want to do is we want to create that. So what we are going to do is we're going to do a Control N. And we want to create a new table in that database. So we're going to select the language. We're going to do SQL again. So the first part we have to say is, okay, we need to use that database that we just created. So the first part we're going to do is use. And select use. And then we're going to say the database we want to use. In my case, it's going to be Vulkan. And you need to spell it the same. And you can see there, IntelliSense just went nuts on me. So what I have to do is just make sure that when I want to do a capitalization, I do caps lock, B. Now I can do B2. Okay, so we're using Vulkan DB2. And then the next part we want to do is that we are going to look for SQL create table. So SQL. And then we want to pick the SQL create table. And then it's going to bring some code across of, okay, this is going to be everything that we need to do that table. And it has 2 different things that have highlighting. The first part is table name. So if we don't touch anything yet, and we just type in employees, it will actually replace all of the employees. So it replace this one, this one, this one, that one. So all the employees got replaced. Way cool. And then what we want to do is select tab, and then it will go to the second one, which is schema name. and we want to replace the schema name, and we're going to replace that one with DBO. And it'll replace all of those. Okay, so we're doing really good. So now what we want to do is we want to go down where it says column 1. We want to replace that. So that one we're going to just have to backspace to replace it. And we're going to replace that with name. And then for column 2, we're going to replace that one, and that's going to be location. Okay, so what we have now is we're using the Vulkan database 2, and we're going to create a new table called employees. And then within there, that table will have 2 different columns. And one of them is going to be called name, and the other one is going to be called location. So now that we have that set, we can run it. So we select our execute query. It'll say, what database do we want to run against? We're going to select Vulkan. And everything plays nice. Should come back and say, command executed successfully. And then if we go to our tables and we do a refresh on our tables, we should now see a DBO underscore employees that is now in our tables. So we're doing pretty good here. So this part went pretty easy. This one, just using the caps lock as our sort of workaround, works pretty well. The next one is the part that gets sort of annoying. Because this IntelliSense really wants to go a little crazy on us. So for the next one, I actually yeah, we'll try and see how well it does. So we keep our use Vulkan DB there. So the next one, what we're going to want to do is we want to insert rows into our employee table. So we're going to do an insert. So here we have insert. So we'll select insert. And so what we're going to have is we're going to insert into a table name, and then we're going to insert some values. Cool, that's going to work for us. So insert into our table name, and our table name happens to be employees. So we can just start typing employees. Okay, so our table is employees. Tab. Okay, we aren't going to actually be doing any columns. So we don't need to worry about that one. We can actually delete that one. And then for values, we can actually hit enter after values because we're going to have a couple of different columns that we're going to be entering. So our first column value is going to be space 1, comma, whoops, let me get, because ours are going to have a couple different, oh, yeah, I skipped a line, sorry. What we wanted to do after employees, we needed to add a line. And what we need to do is put the headers in of what these employees are going to be in and what they mean. So the first thing we have to do is a parentheses. Oops, help if I hit the right key. And then a open bracket. And it's employees ID. So cap locks E, cap locks off, MP. And we can actually go, oops, L. So we can actually have it bring employees over. So sometimes this IntelliSense is helpful. But here, if we do, so cap locks I, cap locks off D, so employee ID, and then on the other side of the bracket, do a comma. Now we need to do another open bracket. And the next one is going to be name, so a cap locks N, oops. All right, I got extra stuff in there. So N. So it's cap locks N, cap locks off. And its name, go on the other side of the bracket, comma, another open bracket. And the next one is going to be location. So cap locks L, cap locks off, OCATION. Okay. And then it already had closed our parentheses. So it's an open parentheses, open bracket, employee's ID, close the bracket, comma, open bracket name, close bracket, comma, open bracket location, close bracket, close parentheses. Okay, so that's defining how our values are going to be entered in here. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to add 4 employees, and we're going to add the values for 4 employees. So what we're going to have is each of these lines are going to be in parentheses, and then they're going to be closed with a comma at the end. So we can actually copy this one. And then the 4th one does not have a comma at the end, which is one that comes back and bites people all the time because they don't realize that. And at the very end, we're going to have the word go, because that will run this. Okay, so in the first one, our values are going to be space 1, comma. So it's going to be employee number 1, space, cap locks N, turn off cap locks, single quote, and then the name for the employee, which is going to be Jared. Close the quote, and then comma, space, cap locks again, N, cap locks off, single quote, and then the country that Jared is from, which is Australia. So cap locks A, cap locks off. So Australia, close your quote. Okay, so that's our first user that we're putting in there. So we put in Jared from Australia. We'll go down to the next line. So the next one is going to be 2. So and then comma, space, cap locks N, cap locks off, single quote, Nikita. So cap locks on again, N, IKITA, single quote, comma, cap locks on, N, cap locks off, single quote, India. So cap locks on again, I, off, NDIA, cap locks on. Okay, and we go down to the next one, which is employee number 3. And that is Tom. That was a little easier. And Tom is from Germany. So, oops. There we go. And the last one we have is employee 4. Employee 4 is Jake. And Jake is from the United States. Okay, and make sure that the last entry does not have a comma after it. Then we have our go. And if everything works right, we should be able to select our execute query. Okay. There we go. I think I had run it twice. Let me see. So in the original lab document, it has you do another step. I'm going to have you actually do a shortcut, and I'll be uploading a slightly revised version of the lab document to do this. So we want to see if the employees actually got into our employee table. So we'll just right click on the employee table, select the top 1,000 rows. They'll give us some code to do that. Then we will select and see, and it runs it. And if everything worked right, you should see your 4 employees that you just put in, and that would be your screenshot for 3S2. Okay, and we're pretty much out of time. Let's see. So the only part that we didn't get to is one where is this part down here of create and run a SQL agent job on Linux. So that we're doing the same things that we just did in Visual Studio Code. Or sorry, no, actually, we're doing these from the command line on our Linux server. So we're doing these on the command line on Vulkan. So it's just one that you have to be really careful when you're doing this editing, because it puts you into SQL command mode when you're on there, and then you have to be precise when you're doing SQL commands, because you can't go up a line. So when you run it, so that's a little annoying when you're running it, but just take your time with this part and it should go pretty smooth. So that's the one part I didn't get to in the demo today. But what we've gotten through will get you through all the way up to 4S1 in Lab 5.5. So it's just the last part of create and run SQL Server agent jobs on Linux that we didn't cover, but that's just doing it right from the command line, right on the Linux server itself. Questions? Covered a lot in a short period of time. Feel confident and ready to tackle it? Oh, everybody's so quiet. Okay, so I will stop the recording there.